Good morning. Good morning. Everybody awake? Good to see you here this morning. I'm Allyson, Sawtell. This is Christine West and Eric McEwen, and we're all members at Washington Park, UCC, here in Denver. So this is a service of readings, of songs, and of silence. And we're going to explore together what it means to be church during these times of environmental justice and justice crises, during times of confusion and brokenness. We are exploring together what it means to be church, which involves going into some hard stuff. So parts of the service, maybe the words, maybe the music, maybe the silence, maybe our singing. Parts of the service may be hard for you and difficult. For example, partway through the service, I'm going to bang the drum. Scientists have told us that a sustainable level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is 350 parts per million. We have not been at that level or gone below it for decades. We are way above. So at one part in the service, I'm going to bang the drum, one bang for each part per million that we are over the safe 350 level. So that's what will be happening later in the service. So parts may be hard, but we are all in this together. So together, let us join in worship.
I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect.
And care for our common home, or Laudato Si by Pope Francis. Our goal is to become painfully aware, to dare to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and thus to discover what each of us can do about it.
When we get serious about the healing of creation, we stop living smoothly in the world. We become rough edges. We snag on conventional wisdom and business as usual. We do not just gently slip by. We are rough edges. This is our birthright.
And with rough edges, proclaiming our imperfections and our possibilities, we live and move and have our being.
Rough edges don't allow us to fit in. We become the burr in the socks, that small stone in the shoe. We are jagged awareness of something different, better. We are rough edges. That is our legacy. When we live and move and have our raggedy being as healers, lovers, and reconcilers, we make choices.
Sometimes we welcome denial. It's easing of our anxiety and fear. It's soft pat on the shoulder so that we can fit in and forget and have some peace of a sort for a time.
Sometimes, through luck or grace, we allow our rough edges to become occasions for imagination, opportunities for awakening, points of courage.
And sometimes, by grace or choice, we remember our birthright and our legacy, and honoring the uneven jaggedness of our efforts, we push on.
Now I invite you to join in as you are comfortable in this congregational song. The words are here. The tune is known as Simple Gifts or Lord of the Dance. And the structure here is 2 verses and then a refrain. It's our call to live simply. This is earth's fervent plea to be one with creation as we were meant to be. We're all tied together and connected by life. We need each other, yet we live in strife. It's our children's right to have a world that is free from hate, war, and fear, and inhumanity. To inherit a world where all earth can thrive, and with love and justice be truly alive. To live rightly within the web of life, bring healing and justice, not greed and strife. And when we get ourselves to that place just right, creation will dance out of sheer delight. It's our call to be listening, it's a gift to be wise, to hear life growing beneath creation's cries, to keep finding hope where we thought there was none, to celebrate even small victories won. It's our call to live simply, it's our call to be one. We need each other, God's work is never done. Live to love as God would have us be, then all creation will truly be free. To live rightly within the web of life, bring healing and justice, not greed and strife. And when we get ourselves to that place just right, creation will dance out of sheer delight. On our good days, gifted by our rough edges, we come awake to creation's pain, our pain. And we set out to heal, to reconcile, to regenerate creation. On our good days, through choice or relentless grace, we come awake to creation's devastation, our devastation. We come awake and shake our heads like a dog shedding water. What were we thinking? Sea levels rise up, poisons pumped into our air, our land, our food. Greed consumes. Poverty swallows whole the most vulnerable among us. When did we ever think this was a good idea? Who are we? On our good days, we could hope for such an awakening, to leap awake like a dog sensing an uninvited presence. But we seem to live mostly without question, unawake. And even when we question and speak out, we stay the same. Fear feeds denial, courage a distant dream. We live unchanged in the shelter of comfort, safety, church, me. We could hope for such an awakening, but we are curled up by the fire, snoozing, dreaming of chasing that cat, when we're supposed to leap up and shake our heads, our whole bodies, and look around the room, for something is not right. On our good days, we are rough edges to tear away denial and awake to dream. So as we sing this next song, that is when the beating of the drum will happen.
Afterwards.
After this song. Again, it will be one beat of the drum for every part per million that we are over the safe level of 350 for a sustainable Earth.
to be in tomb time. Flowers peeking out in early spring's warm sun.
Then comes frost and snow.
Flowers, minus some greenery. Again, peeking out in late spring.
Oh, look, a hailstorm.
In the aftermath, eventually, surprisingly, some return and begin to bud. The question is, at what point will they not come back? What happens when hope dies and the light goes out in your heart? Creation's hope is dying. The light is fading from the heart of all life.
This is tomb time, the day after Good Friday. This is tomb time. It was bound to happen sooner or later.
This is where words stop, logic fails, and nothing makes sense.
Let it go. Lie down in the cold and dark for a time. All that is disappearing is worthy of this grief. This is tomb time. And then you begin to hold, however feebly, to the memory of a story that says the tomb is not the end. The stone is rolled away by the grace and strength of all of us.
Now you decide whether to move through the door into life again. And it's not just you, or you over there in the back pew. It's all of us, the church, needing to decide if we will step through into new life.
Our destruction of creation, our clinging to business as usual, seal us into death. The strength and love of communities of hope will roll the stone away.
Church, what will you decide? Church, what will you proclaim? Church, what will you dare to hope?
Church, here and now, you have a choice. Push back against business as usual, embrace imagination and courage, or give in to Good Friday.
It must be here, and it must be now.
Our God calls to us, what will we reply to God's call for justice, God's call for peace? Together with courage, let us say yes, and live with love that will never cease.
Breathe. Breathe. Just breathe. With sighs too deep for words, just breathe. You are held as you breathe. You will not fall. Breathe. Just breathe. What do you want to hold? What do you want to give? What do you want to keep with you? What do you want to shed? Breathe. Just breathe. Let us breathe together. Create in me a new heart, O God. 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 Create in me a new heart, O God.
We will now bless each other. God knows we need it. And then we will be led forth in song and in hope. The responsive blessing is in your bulletin. May your arms be open wide to allow for a broken heart. May your arms be wide open to welcome imagination. May we live with arms wide open, wide enough to embrace the questions and the tomb time. May we live with arms wide open to embrace curiosity and hope.
Where is hope and where is promise in a world that's gone astray? Fear and apathy wreak havoc, web of life just slips away. When creation's pain is ours to win, hard truths we dare to hear, we will live with power and justice, hope will triumph over fear. Let's not live in deep denial of earth's woes, the power of greed. As we try to build a new world, courage is our deepest need. When creation's pain is ours to win, our truths we dare to hear, we will live with power and justice. Hope will triumph over fear. Be the hope and be the promise, be the peace the world must know. This is good work that is hard to and frustratingly so slow. When creation's pain is ours to win, our truths we dare to hear, we will live with power and justice. Hope will triumph over fear. This is hope and this is promise. Laugh and love in spite of fear. Dare to know you make a difference. Change the world and dry a tear. Then creation's joy is ours to dance with all we hold so dear. We have lived with power and justice. Hope has triumphed over fear.
When we get serious about the healing of creation, we stop living smoothly in the world.
Oh, all you burrs in the socks, you aggravating stones in the shoes, journey on.
Oh, you rough edges and raggedy souls, shine on.
Oh, all you who are in this moment in tomb time, hang on.
Oh, beloved community, you who keep trying, you who cannot stop crying.
You who show us the courage of laughter in the face of frightening times. You who wish you were stronger, yet you never give up.
You who choose every day to be healers and reconcilers of creation, and you who wish to be so.
You, courageous, fearful, insistent, creative, trembling, strong, and imperfect beings, rough edges, and raggedy souls. You, church, blessed be you.
Now let us continue the work together.
I invite you to rise as you're willing and able for this last song, which is to the tune of Will the Circle Be Unbroken? Oh, the circle of creation, it must be made whole. We're connected to each other. We are all one living soul. Let's keep working, let's be strong now. Keep the circle whole for all. There's a new world we are building. Healing justice is our call. All creation groans in anguish. Will it die, Lord, will we die? Where's the hope for life to flourish? This our cry, Lord, this our cry. Let's keep working. What's wrong now? Keep the circle whole for all. There's a new world we are building. Healing justice is our call. life within us, life around us, creatures, water, earth, and sky, all cry out for healing justice. We will try, Lord, we will try. Let's keep working, let's be strong now. Keep the circle whole for all. There's a new world we are building. Healing justice is our call. Devastation, violent suffering, this creation's deepest sigh. That is not the final word here. Hope and love will be our cry. Let's keep working, let's keep working. Let's be strong now. Keep the circle whole for all. There's a new world we are building. Healing justice is our call. There's a new world. There's a new world we are building. Healing justice is our call.
Amen.
Good morning. I hope you're all waking up and getting warm because I was freezing this morning. We are very happy now to have Jim Antal talk to us in his first keynote, and I'm sure it's going to be very informative. Jim, go for it.
So let me test the mic first. Is it sounding okay? Everybody good? All right, good. I just have to begin by commenting on the worship service and extending, I think on behalf of all of us, a gratitude for that worship service. Can we have some applause? I've been addressing events like this since, I don't know, the mid-90s. And it is so rare, with this being my calling and in a way my profession, that I feel ministered to by original worship. And this morning I felt it. And I'm just so grateful for our three leaders and for the time. But it's not just the time, it's the depth that is required to shape a worship service like that. Wouldn't it be something if all of our churches every Sunday tapped into that depth? That would be maybe the most significant outcome of this gathering that I could ever hope for. Let me say one other word before I get into my text here. I put out there before worship a handout, and Peter also had this information on the handout that he had out by the book table. My book that came out in 2018, Climate Church, Climate World, ended up being the bestseller of my publisher from the religion division. So when they got a new editor came in August, he called me up and he said, geez, you want to revise it and we'll issue a new edition. So that new edition is coming out in March, late March, I think. And this is there's a code available on this handout that if you order 10 or more copies, you can get a 35% discount. And there are churches, right now there are literally hundreds of churches that I'm aware of, but over the course of the past 4 or 5 years, there have been thousands of churches that have read it as kind of a church read. So I would just encourage you to consider that and take one of those flyers if you like. I want to begin my formal remarks by praising everyone who recognized many years ago the importance of focusing this gathering on climate justice. The remarkable resilience that all of you, particularly the planners of this gathering, have demonstrated convinces me that you are ready to face the realities of the climate crisis and that you recognize that the only way out of this crisis is to go through it, to face the crisis and go through it with hope. Thank you for continuing to affirm the importance of the work we are doing at this gathering and for recognizing this work and witness is essential to the witness of Christ's church in our day. And a special thanks to my partner, Peter Sawtell, whose ministry I have admired for decades, as I think all of you have as well. Together with the organizers of this event, you're offering truly remarkable opportunities for participants to engage in this crisis. Now, in addition to hosting an inspirational event, I want you to know that you're not alone. In just the past year, I have addressed 8 such gatherings as this in 6 different states. When the climate movement began back in 2007, I would remind congregations that one of the reasons our church buildings have steeples is to alert the town when an emergency occurs by sounding the alarm, usually by ringing the church bell. Today, we're gathered because we have heard that alarm. And we want to come together to respond to the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced. And let me invite you during my presentation to jot down any questions you may have. I won't think of you as being distracted. I'll think of you as being engaged. And I really look forward to hearing and responding to whatever questions you come up with. That's a top priority of mine. So addressing climate is such an enormous challenge. The topic is so big, the problem so overwhelming, it's helpful to have some guidance. So with that in mind, I'm going to break it down into 7 steps. It's not a sequence. Different people will take each one of these steps in their own sequence. But I think each step is important and perhaps essential. So let's get started. First, fall in love. Fall in love with God's creation. I was 20 when I fell in love with your Rocky Mountains. I've had the pleasure of camping, backpacking, and cycling from northern Montana to New Mexico. The beauty of your area is breathtaking. Living where you do, taking this first step, falling in love with God's creation is easy. And I want to encourage you every single day, and perhaps multiple times each day, to take a deep breath, as we did during worship. Take a deep breath and allow yourself to be grateful for the beauty, the diversity, the grandeur that surrounds you. That's the first step. Fall in love with God's creation. Here's the second step. Recognize the assault and realize the threat. Let me illustrate why it's urgent that we take action on climate immediately. For the past 2 summers, regions as much as 70 miles above the Arctic Circle were overcome by a daytime high over 50 degrees Fahrenheit above normal, hitting an all-time high above the Arctic Circle of 118 degrees Fahrenheit. And last March, places in the Antarctic were 70 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. We now know that air pollution caused by the burning of fossil fuels kills almost 9 million people every year. That's more than HIV, AIDS, and tuberculosis combined. And that doesn't even include the lives lost due to the impact of the increase in global warming. A 2021 study reports that if global warming exceeds 1.5 degrees centigrade, the world's tropics could become uninhabitable. 2.5 billion people live in the world's tropics. In other words, the past decade has been the hottest decade since records have been kept, and the past decade will be the coolest decade your children and your grandchildren will ever experience. It's not only heat. Last August, unprecedented monsoons flooded 1/3 of Pakistan, killing over 1,600 people and displacing over 30 million. And between mid-July and mid-August last summer, 5 states here in the U.S. experienced 1 in 1,000 year rain events. Imagine 9 months of rain in one day. It's not just deluge, it's also drought. That's why we call it climate chaos. Europe's drought is the worst in 500 years. And with the possible exception of California, much of the American West is experiencing what some experts call a once-in-a-thousand-year drought. rather than offer more examples, let me provide some perspective. If you look back in time at Earth's climate, you'll see that it's only over the past 10,000 years, about 400 generations, that the climate has provided humanity with a stable enough pattern for people to settle down, to farm our own food, and to live in year-round communities. Thus, civilization emerges from and depends upon a stable climate, or what I like to call the continuity of creation. But that continuity is now broken. Once the industrial era began, it took us only 7 generations to decreate the planet. Over the past 200 years, humanity has extracted and burned about half the coal, oil, and gas that nature took 150 million years to create. That's how the developed countries built the modern world. In doing so, a tiny percentage of us became unimaginably wealthy, profiting from the control over and the abuse of the resources that they had nothing to do with creating. At the same time, a majority of people worldwide are living amidst increased inequality, poverty, hunger, homelessness, and lack of potable water. These injustices are casualties of the unjust acquisition, extraction, distribution, and profit from the energy stored under our feet. And to address these injustices, humanity must complete the greatest transition we have ever attempted, moving from our dependency on fossil fuel to a reliance on renewable and sustainable forms of energy. So what's been holding us back? As we'll see in a minute, the solutions are all available today. So why haven't politicians, industry leaders, and consumers embraced those solutions? What's been keeping us from making the necessary transition? Here, a little history is helpful. Way back in 1965, when President Johnson received the first report on global warming, he responded by saying, and I quote, "The destiny of humanity and the rest of creation are intimately linked. We flourish and perish together." In 1970, the first Earth Day saw 20 million Americans take to the streets. At that time, it was 10% of the US population. It took only a few months for Congress to create the Environmental Protection Agency and pass the Clean Air Act, which President Nixon signed. 2 years later, Congress passed the Clean Water Act. And a year after that, Congress passed the Endangered Species Act. And it's worth remembering that in 2006, President George W. Bush, the former Texas oil man, declared America is addicted to oil and insisted that the United States break this addiction. So if presidents in both parties expressed these kinds of concerns, something else must be causing our inaction. Of course, there are many factors, but the driving reason we have not broken our addiction to fossil fuel is that since their inception, fossil fuel corporations have had one and only one goal: to make the most money for their shareholders in each quarter. Keeping that goal in mind, here's some additional history. In 1975, when the fossil fuel corporations heard that the world was on the brink of global warming, they quickly hired the best climate scientists in the world. As early as 1977, those scientists told the board of Exxon that climate change is caused by humans burning fossil fuel. It's getting worse. And while the oceans are absorbing most of the excess CO2, that will not continue indefinitely. A new study just came out this year shows that as far back as 1977, the oil companies' climate scientists predicted exactly the global warming impacts we see today. But instead of releasing these reports, Exxon hired the best ocean scientists and asked them if the oceans were saving us. And in the mid-1980s, the ocean scientists confirmed those findings. And about that same time, Exxon's engineers reported a breakthrough in their ability to drill horizontally through shale. This allowed Exxon to extract more natural gas than anyone could ever imagine, what we today refer to as fracking. So, what did Exxon do? First, they fired those climate scientists and buried their reports. And then Exxon hired a few fake scientists, the same fake scientists that the tobacco industry had hired in 1975 to convince America smoking did not cause cancer. Just as these fake scientists had sown the seeds of doubt about whether smoking caused cancer, they began to sow the seeds of doubt about whether climate change was real. Over the past 4.5 decades, fossil fuel corporations and their think tank partners have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on various disinformation campaigns and supporting politicians who will do their bidding. To this day, America remains the only place in the world where climate denial has any political or cultural traction. To learn more about this, I would highly recommend that you watch the documentary film called Merchants of Doubt, which thoroughly examines the issue of science denial funded by fossil fuel corporations. The documentary is based on a book by the same title, Merchants of Doubt, by my friend and Harvard professor Naomi Oreskes. Also last May, PBS released a Frontline series that tells this story in 3 episodes. Now that we understand the assault on God's creation, as difficult as it may be, we must take the third step. We must allow ourselves to feel the pain. Serving as a guide for this difficult task is someone whose name will be familiar to all of you, Greta Thunberg. Greta first heard about the climate crisis when she was 8 years old. What she saw while watching several educational movies affected her greatly. Looking back, she reports, "I began thinking about it all the time, and I became very sad." Such was her pain that over the next few years, she fell into depression, talked with very few people beyond her immediate family. For the most part, she stopped eating, and as a consequence of that, she stopped growing. Eventually, what made her begin to feel better were her parents. Greta felt that they really listened to her and really heard her. They didn't try to erase the pain. Instead, they demonstrated their solidarity by no longer eating meat and by becoming vegan. In 2016, Greta's mother showed her support by taking another, more major step. As a well-known opera singer, her career depended on traveling far and wide. Listening to her daughter's critique of flying as a major contributor to the climate crisis, Greta's mother stopped flying. Because she was well known, her no-fly decision drew a lot of public attention. Over the next 2 years, she and her husband would write a book about how Greta had changed them. In the fall of 2018, 15-year-old Greta Thunberg skipped school and headed for the sidewalk out in front of the Swedish parliament, where she sat down holding her hand-painted sign that read, "School Strike for Climate." A few days later, others joined her. By November 2018, more than 17,000 students in 24 countries had taken part in what had come to be known as Fridays for the Future. When TEDx in Stockholm invited 15-year-old Greta Thunberg to address their audience, yes, she gave a TED Talk at age 15, she shared the pain she had felt since first learning about the climate crisis when she was 8. She told the audience that from her study of the science, it was clear that everything had to change. And she concluded by recognizing that people need hope. And she affirmed that once we start to act, hope is everywhere. I want to just mention a very different example of a well-known person who recently, much to his own surprise, allowed himself to feel the pain, the cry of creation. At 90 years of age, the captain of Starship Enterprise, William Shatner, became the oldest person to travel into space. As it turns out, the experience filled him with overwhelming sadness. Last October, he wrote, I'm quoting now, "Every day, we are confronted with the knowledge of further destruction of Earth at our hands, the extinction of animal species, of flora and fauna, things that took 5 billion years to evolve, and suddenly we will never see them again because of the interference of mankind. It filled me with dread." Shatner exemplifies another one of Greta's brilliant insights. Greta tells us hope starts with honesty. And as both Shatner and Greta exemplify, honesty involves talking about your sadness, your grief, your love of nature, your heartbreak over the fact that we're destroying God's creation. Evangelical Christian and climate scientist Katherine Hayhoe says that talking about the climate crisis may be the most important thing an individual can do. It's my experience that the smoke of grief and the fire of love are inseparable. For anyone who loves life, who loves their children, or delights in the natural world, recognizing the realities of climate change will trigger grief. And as you allow yourself to experience the pain, you may find yourself feeling a new and confusing emotion. More and more people are feeling a sadness or grief over the loss of places or a particular place they regard as home. The word for this new emotion is solastalgia. Solastalgia. Let's make sure our houses of worship are safe enough places for us to honestly share our grief, and by doing so, give rise to a life of hope and action. Now we take the fourth step. For the past few minutes, I've been focusing on the importance of allowing ourselves to feel the pain. It's only natural that as you allow yourself to feel the pain, you'll want to attend to the source of your pain. Let me share a story, a parable of sorts, that explains what I mean when I say we need to attend to the source of our pain. And this may be a story that you've heard from other pulpits. One day, The quiet life of a village that stood at the edge of a river was interrupted by a scream. While sitting on a park bench alongside the river, a woman saw a bleeding body floating down the rapids. Several people responded, jumped into the river, pulled the person out, and attended to their injuries. A while later, someone saw another body floating down the river. That person called for help, jumped into the river, grabbed the person's arm, and with help, pulled a second body from the river. Over the next few hours, the good people of this village pulled several more bodies from the river and did their best to attend to them. The mayor called for a town meeting. And when the townspeople assembled in the town square, a teenager interrupted the mayor, and she shouted out, "I'm going upstream. Who's coming with me? We need to stop these assaults. We need to confront the source of these attacks and put an end to them." Since 2011, the climate movement has been driven more and more by young people, by people of color, and by indigenous people. And all of them have been shouting, we need to go upstream. We need to focus our attention on the supply side of the crisis. And the climate movement has been doing just that. Beginning in 2011, we focused on stopping fossil fuel infrastructure from being built. Since then, not only has the Keystone XL pipeline been canceled, so were dozens and perhaps even hundreds of unnecessary pipelines, and hundreds of coal-fired power plants have been closed. In 2012, the climate movement began to call for divestment from fossil fuel corporations. In 2013, our denomination, the United Church of Christ, led the way in this effort. When the UCC passed a resolution that I wrote, we became the first religious organization and the first national organization to vote to divest. And in only 10 years' time, portfolios worth over $40 trillion, that's trillion with a T, portfolios worth over $40 trillion have purged their holdings of fossil fuel stock. Because fossil fuel companies continue to do all they can to expand their infrastructure so that they can extract still more fossil fuel, they need funding for this. And this has birthed another supply-side campaign. It goes by many names: Stop the Money Pipeline, Banking on Our Future, Defund Climate Chaos, Discredit Bad Banks. If you have money invested with JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citibank, or Bank of America, you might consider joining the protests that are being organized for March 21st. As Bill McKibben says, money is the oxygen on which the fire of global warming burns. I'd be glad to talk more about this in our Q&A time. A year ago, in April, over 1,000 scientists risked arrest by putting their bodies on the line in over 25 countries as they sounded the alarm about the urgency and injustice of the climate crisis. My friend, NASA scientist Peter Kalmus, was among them. He was arrested at Chase Bank in Pasadena, protesting Chase Bank's funding of new fossil fuel infrastructure. The current plans, by the way, for new fossil fuel infrastructure is to build enough pipelines over the next 5 years, pipelines that, if strung out in length, could go around the world twice. Imagine if universities stopped accepting funding from fossil fuel companies to conduct climate research. Over 500 academics from many of the most prestigious universities have demanded just that. What if the fossil fuel industry was unable to find a PR firm or an advertising agency to spin the fossil fuel industry's false and deceptive narratives that seek to misinform the public? A new organization, Clean Creatives is its name, is an effort to convince PR and advertising agencies to stop working with the fossil fuel industry. Over 65 cities, including New York, as well as the states of California, Massachusetts, and now several others, have passed laws banning gas stoves, gas furnaces, and other gas appliances in any new construction. Another way to weaken the source of the climate crisis is to expose the 100 elite law firms which have facilitated an almost inconceivable $1.33 trillion in fossil fuel transactions, litigated over 350 major cases on behalf of fossil fuel corporations, and received nearly $35 million to lobby for fossil fuel interests. A new organization called Law Students for Climate Accountability is working to hold those other lawyers and law firms accountable. For our fifth step, it's essential that we celebrate the progress we have made. 85% of Americans agree that we have a moral responsibility to create a safe and healthy environment for ourselves and for our children. Americans who think that global warming is happening now outnumber those who think it is not happening by more than 6 to 1. And for the first time, a majority of Americans now say that people in the United States are being harmed right now by global warming. It's also important to recognize the environmental sea change that has occurred since January 2021. Since he took office, President Biden has overturned 85 of former President Trump's deregulation actions. And Biden is working to roll back another 88. In addition, that's not all. Biden has approved 59 new policies and is working to add another 55. In the fall of 2021, Congress passed the infrastructure bill that included over $200 billion for climate-related projects. And last August, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, also called the IRA. The IRA includes $370 billion of climate and energy-related projects, by far the largest commitment our country has ever made to address the climate crisis. In addition to that funding, the IRA explicitly grants the EPA the authority to regulate greenhouse gas pollution, as well as to encourage the transition from clean energy sources, including wind and solar energy. Here's some additional good news. Climate change is now a national security priority for the Pentagon, the Justice Department, the Energy Department, the Environmental Protection Agency. Note anymore, it's a headline. Across the country, people are beginning to realize what most of you already know, that environmental justice is jobs with justice. Environmental justice is housing justice. Environmental justice is health justice. Environmental justice is indigenous justice. Environmental justice is racial justice. And here's something else we can celebrate. As many of you already know, we can do this. We already have all the solutions we need to undertake this transition. A group of the world's top climate scientists recently issued a report indicating that by 2030, electricity from solar, wind, and water could provide all the electricity the world needs by 2030. And by 2035, renewable energy could be the sole energy source for all the world's heating, cooling, transportation, and industry. Furthermore, another new study indicates that making this transition will pay for itself in 6 years. Not only that, but as we make this transition, we can address economic and racial inequalities, and by doing so, we can reap benefits far greater than any of the costs. Just as we are celebrating our progress, it's time for the 6th step. It's time to receive God's call. Usually we think of calling or vocation as something personal. God may call this individual to pursue that path, while God may call another individual to champion a different passion. Often, as all of you know, the mission of a congregation is shaped by individuals, and we all know their names, who effectively recruit others to join them in their cause, right? And to commit a portion of the church budget to, yes, I see all of you nodding because you can all give names to the people I'm referring to here. But, you know, this is not the only understanding of calling. When we examine Scripture, it becomes obvious God also calls communities, not just individuals. Nevertheless, in America, where our centuries-long celebration of rugged individualism persists, the idea that God might be calling a congregation or an entire town or a nation to come together to embrace a particular mission, such an idea is roundly dismissed. It's as if it never occurred to me. A communal call, a universal call. Living as we are on the hinge of history, the climate crisis places an inescapable moral claim on our generation and therefore on every one of us. It urges our generation to embrace a fresh understanding of human freedom, fulfillment, vocation, and salvation. Can we accept that we are most free when we embrace our interdependence? That we are most fulfilled when we are grateful for having enough? That God's call, our vocation, is to recognize that we're all in this together, and that God is offering us not just personal salvation, but collective salvation. If we can, we will create an unstoppable mandate to restore creation. There was a time not too long ago when a generation of Americans and our allies recognized solidarity as a survival strategy. A time when they understood the importance of we. That generation realized that World War II placed an inescapable moral claim on them. That moral claim prompted that generation to accept a common, universal calling. More than 40 million individuals sacrificed their lives. Tens of thousands of churches converted their pristine lawns to victory gardens. Tens of millions of Americans became vegetarians so that the troops would have enough protein. Recognizing that civilization itself was at risk, people came together accepting the reality we don't get to do what we want. We need to do what has to be done. For this reason and others, young adults in that generation came to be known as the greatest generation. the God of many names, is calling everyone alive today to recognize that our generation, no matter what generation you may be part of, I can never keep all the generational things straight, but that our generation, all of those generations, has a vocation, a common, universal calling. It's time for people of faith to make God's call to restore creation and advance climate justice an essential part of our identity, so that we can leave a fair and stable planet for our kids and grandkids and for all future generations. It's time for each of us to accept that we often have more influence than we recognize. It's time for each of us to call upon our gifts, our energy, our time, our skills, and our assets as we join with others in doing what urgently needs to be done. It's time for our generation to conjure the tireless resolve needed to reverse our current course so that we may restore our common home. Clergy, as well as every community leader, have a special role to play in inspiring their people to initiate a pivot in our identity, self-understanding, and vocation. Now it's time for the seventh and final step. It's time for us to engage our new vocation. Not long after the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its 2018 report, an op-ed piece brought just such an invitation to the readers of the New York Times. The headline was striking: "Stopping climate change is hopeless. Let's do it." After enumerating many of the most depressing realities of climate change, the authors declare, and I'm quoting, "We're perfect for the job. If the human species specializes in one thing, it's taking on the impossible. We are constitutionally equipped to understand the situation." Now, understanding is one thing. Taking action is another. The authors describe how spiritual practice can help us exchange some of our current habits for new practices and disciplines that have the power to be salvific. They believe that the path out of this mess will lead us to become more like the beloved community. The work that is required of us, and I'm quoting here, would endow our lives with some of the oldest and most numinous aspirations of humankind: leading a good life, treating our neighbors well, imbuing our short existence with timeless ideas like grace, dignity, respect, tolerance, and love. The authors continue: "The climate crisis struggle embodies the essence of what it means to be human, which is that we strive for the divine." Another good news testimony comes from climate scientist Simon Donner, professor of climatology at the University of British Columbia. Last May, Professor Donner recorded a brilliant TEDx talk that invites his audience to recognize that we are living in a moment of immense opportunity, and that using our imagination is the key to solving the climate crisis. Because we are living in such anxious times, the anxiety can stifle the imagination. And it's essential for us to take time to quiet down, to silence the clamor of requests that demand our attention, and to listen to the still, small voice of God. When we do, we might find ourselves in the company of Esther, confronted with the realization that perhaps we were born for just such a time as this, Perhaps our generation was born to put an end to these interconnected systemic injustices. The subjugation of other humans who are not our color, the colonization of land that is not our own, the extraction of nature's wealth that we did not create. Perhaps God is calling our generation to recognize we really do live at the same address with the number 420 emblazoned above every door and dwelling. That's 420 parts per million. At a time of ideological division, perhaps God is calling all of humanity to unite as we recognize that we really are all in this together. I believe God is calling our generation to live into a new story, a fossil fuel-free story, a story in which we join millions of others as we realign our time, our energy, our gifts, our attention, and our assets to respond to the call now heard around the world. That call can be heard in the streets of countless cities every Friday when thousands of young people are insisting that we end the era of fossil fuel. That call can be heard in the boardrooms of Exxon and other fossil fuel companies as more and more of their stockholders purge their portfolios of fossil fuel holdings, adding to the more than $40 trillion that have divested since 2012. That call can be heard in the courtrooms where fossil fuel companies, pipeline developers, and other corporate profiteers are being sued by cities, states, and children for violating their legal rights. That call can be heard on university campuses when they ban the fossil fuel industry from recruiting on campus. That call can be heard in the halls of Congress as elected leaders must choose between the vast majority of Americans who are demanding climate action now and the fossil fuel corporate lobbyists whose influence must be set aside. Believing that another more just world is possible, let us become the generation that finally blows the whistle and declares, "Not on my watch." Let us begin to live into a new story, a story shaped by the unifying power of shared vulnerability, the expansive fullness of interdependence, the contagious generosity of caring for the least of these among us, and our universal calling to protect God's great gift of creation. Let the people say, Amen.
Questions and answers.
Now, just so you know, we are streaming all of this, and we will let the churches have the links in the beginning of the week, because you wouldn't have come if we gave it to you now.
And
We will be publicizing the links.
And to the point about the paper, I don't have my footnote page here, but there's at least 70 footnotes in here.
Yeah.
I'm a science geek, so that goes with the territory, I guess. Okay, first question. Thank you.
So I'm a scientist also. I admit that in public. And I'm also a cradle-to-grave scientist. So I mentioned some of that in the talk last night. And although I'm very attuned to the possibility of electric vehicles, I also am someone who looks at, okay, where do we get the resources for that? But the other, I'm also someone that can take seemingly impossible things and make them work rather than throw them out. And throwing out cars that use fossil fuels is a concern for me in a cradle to grave. And I'm wondering if you have, so I've been reading up on some of the literature about biofuels. If we have, one of the things I've talked about before is agriculture that's sustainable and sequestering. But there's also supposed to be research being done on sustainable harvesting of certain kinds of seaweed that can be used just like fossil fuels. So do you have a sense of this balance of not just saying we're going to throw all the cars out or we're going to throw all the jet planes out, or like what are we looking at for that balance? So we're saying it's kind of like say no to drugs. We're saying no to fossil fuels, and what are we saying yes to that can keep us from creating more waste than we already have? Because that's what we clean up hazardous waste sites, and we see a lot of that. But I'm interested in that. I mean, just starting to understand and explore some of that. So I appreciate your input.
So thanks for the question, and it's a really excellent question. So I have several comments. I won't go on too long on this, but I just have several comments to say. First is there is a ton of disinformation, much of which is much better funded than the accurate information, which scientists, and I apologize to all scientists present here, scientists are not real good as sort of public advocates. They're real good at digging into the details of their science, right? I see some agreement among the scientists in here. So that's my first comment, is that in the public realm, there is endless disinformation about this. Second comment, the transition will take place in a somewhat orderly fashion. By 2040, there will be very few fossil-fueled cars on the road. Now, what happens between now and 2040 is hard to tell. Some of you may be aware of a transition that took place many decades ago. Ready for this? That was when General Motors bought all of the city trolleys. No, they were not in the trolley business. They bought them to junk them so that people would buy GM cars. You can get that history from a fabulous old movie called The Death of the Electric Car, which is better than, if they made a sequel to it, The Death of the Electric Car 2 or something like that, that's not really as good. So it's unpredictable how the transition from fossil-fueled vehicles to that will happen. But already in Scandinavia, last year, more than 50% of the cars bought last year in Scandinavia were fully electric cars. It's a shocking number. What? Are you kidding me? And here in America, I believe, now don't quote me on this, but I believe the figure last year in America was 50% of the cars bought in America were either hybrid or all electric in America. Now, why doesn't every American know that? That's because that kind of information isn't funded for you to know. What's funded for you to know, to respond to another part of your question, is that ExxonMobil is putting millions of dollars into algae as an alternative biofuel. We all heard that in 2018 when Exxon was greenwashing its behavior. What you didn't hear was an announcement a month ago that Exxon is now canceling their involvement. I heard that program on NPR, but I did want to make reference to Exxon, though, because Exxon is now out of the seaweed business because because that greenwash is no longer working for them, okay? There are all kinds of promising things, to your point about seaweed. There are all kinds of promising things that are emerging, and what will determine which succeed will be funding. And that has always been the case. You know, every kid in Japan, this may or may not surprise you, every kid in Japan knows the name of the American inventor of the transistor. Every kid in Japan knows that name, and no child in America knows that name. And that's because we gave up that technology. Because for whatever reason, we chose not to fund it. This new action, I forget what another excellent thing that has happened in the past 2 years was the CHIPS Act or something like that, that got funded, you know, to the tune of $100 billion or something like that. And it's the current administration's attempt to change that long history. So we have to be informed and knowledgeable in order to respond. I want to, you didn't mention the word lithium, but it was implied in your comments, and that's something that a lot of you are aware of. For batteries, for effective portable batteries to be made, you know, en masse, requires a lot of lithium. There's plenty of lithium in the world for this. The question is, will it be extracted in a way that parallels the extraction of coal, oil, and gas, and therefore harms the earth? Or can it be extracted, and then once it is configured into batteries, can those batteries be effectively recycled, in contrast with the recycling that happens in America today, which completely stinks, and that's again because of funding reasons. Can that lithium be effectively recycled? And the answer to that is it can. Whether it will or not will be determined by whether or not people demand that we have a sustainable earth going forward. So you can hear in all of my comments, you know, everything I'm saying is informed by the nature of capitalism. And capitalism is what is now on the stand right now. And humanity is drawing its conclusion about whether capitalism is a viable economic means going forward, or if some modification of capitalism is needed, as I believe it is. All right, next question.
I would like to ask you, how will this affect individuals or that section of the community that are marginal in terms of income? Because you're talking about something that not only takes time but money, and when you're walking that thin line, having a hybrid car, for example, isn't really an option. You know, when you talk about, you know, having the plug-in for the electricity, et cetera, et cetera. So how can we make it work for everybody?
So that's such a good question. Thank you for this question. And I feel, all right, maybe I'm the only one in the room that has had trouble over the past several years feeling pride about what our federal government is up to. But I'm proud to say that our federal government in this bill, this IRA bill that has just been passed, there's a huge section in it on environmental justice. And it specifically addresses the question you just had, and it is setting aside a significant portion of what is in that bill to provide kind of recharging ability for electric cars, and to put that in economically deprived communities. Well, now that's changing. She said it takes so long to charge these cars. And it turns out that the newer cars now now have batteries with, what is called by different names, but it's essentially quick charging. So that you can get a charge in 30 minutes that will, last you 50 miles at least. And it's shocking to most people, but like 90% of the mileage driven on cars in America is driven within 20 miles of where they are parked. It sounds crazy, but it's true.
May not have.
No, this is, you're specifically imagining like, geez, how is this transition in an economically deprived community going to actually play itself out? But I want to pick up on something that you said. Younger people are less interested, they're really less interested in owning cars. There's the trends in terms of young people actually even getting driver's licenses. It's shocking. The percentages of young people that aren't getting driver's licenses over the past 20 years has just gone higher and higher and higher. But they are getting bikes. And here in Denver, they're getting electric bikes and they're getting a rebate for them. Thank you, Denver. And you're setting an example for places all over the country. But let me continue with a little momentum here to your point. Paris, as some of you may know, over the past 5 years, so it's not been a real long time, in 5 years, Paris has closed down 20% of its road mileage to cars. Paris. And what has happened? The Parisians hated it for about 6 months. And then they just loved it. Wow, no cars, no pollution. We get to walk. We get to ride our bikes. And it's an astonishing transition. And mayors of major cities, I'm sure including Denver, if you guys are financing electric bikes, I'm sure your mayor and hopefully your next mayor, what is it, one of 17 or something, is gonna be well aware of this transition in Paris. Yes, back there.
For your keynote, it was a lot of good stuff in there. You talked about celebrating progress. You mentioned the City of Denver Electric Bike Program, organizations, government groups, funding kind of climate action, stuff like that. I was wondering, Colorado has some clean energy targets they've laid out as a state. I think 80% of electric generation by 2030 has to be from renewable sources and 100% by 2045. Maybe you know the exact numbers on that. No worries.
Because I'm from Vermont, so I don't know what's going on here. But I knew that was something along those lines, yes.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering, for our state here, what you think that's going to kind of look like, what challenges we might face, kind of what your thoughts are on that.
So what it's going to look like is transition. And what will happen in the context of transition is that the forces that have vested interest in the status quo will fight like dogs. And they will pour money not into what their enterprise is, whichever version of fossil fuel it's linked with. They will pour money into creating lies and deceit about the transition in order to convince the people that this transition is unnecessary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That much I can tell you for certain. But just to speak, I can't comment on specifics as to what Colorado and particularly Denver's transition will look like. But what I can say is to just give you some comparisons. Something else France has done, and I could pick other countries as an example, but I just have France on my mind for some reason, is that any new parking lot built in France must be sheltered by solar panels. So one of the things that's going to happen in order to meet that 2030 goal is that your parking lots are going to be sheltered by solar panels. So the Catholic Cardinal, Sean O'Malley in Boston, who was my counterpart, if you will, for the Catholic Church when I was head of the UCC in Massachusetts, he created a new office for the diocese. They sold this very, very elaborate mansion that they had, and he built sort of a cheap office. But what he did was he covered, this was in 2016, 2015, he covered the parking lot with solar panels, and it was the front page of the Boston Globe. And that kind of leverage, if you will, that a church leader has can have a huge counterbalancing effect on the first thing that I said about the money that's going to pour in to try to deceive the public as to what's going on. So, on the one hand, prepare yourselves for transitions because, 2030 is approaching, right? But on the other hand, I would hope that, every church, at least in our denomination, but there's no reason why it couldn't be every church in Colorado, could become, well, maybe not everyone, I don't want to sound naive, could become advocates for whatever this new rollout begins to look like. And as it begins, that's when the advocacy is so important so that momentum can be maintained. Thank you for your question.
So I'm wondering, as people of faith, if we're thinking too small and if our powers of imagination are underutilized. Because I'm thinking about things like, electric cars and not installing gas stoves, and those are such small shifts, which is not to belittle them, but they are not exercising our imagination. And I think, a tiny bit of shameless self-promotion. So one of the things that we can do in our ministry, and what I do in my ministry at La Foret, is try to imagine and create and experience the world as it could be. And I think that is the power of our faith tradition. And so how can we utilize that to think bigger?
Thank you for communicating the support so immediately. You're exactly right. You're exactly right. And as you and many others in the room know, you're trading on Walter Brueggemann in terms of his embrace of prophetic imagination, a book he wrote way back in the 70s. It continues to be, in my mind, the best source of inspiration for the point that you're asking. We all of us, how do I want to put this? I'm worried that if I say what I'm really thinking about what the role of church is in this time. So my book, Climate Church, Climate World, I wanted to call it Repurposing Church for a Climate Crisis World. But the editor wouldn't allow the title. Also, my wife didn't much like the title because she's not sort of business oriented. But I wanted to mix the sort of, what many of these questions have been kind of businessy and practical and money oriented and all of that, transitional questions. And the church needs to roll up its sleeves and be engaged in that. But mostly it needs to be engaged with imagination beyond our puny horizons. And that's kind of my favorite word for this, is that we need to extend our horizon. And I mean, what would it be like if pastors were to lock arms and say, gee, for the next year, we're all of us going to commit in our preaching to challenge ourselves to the kind of embrace of imagination that you just articulated, and then share with each other, in a kind of a supportive way, what we're saying and how we're challenging our congregations. And the reason I suggest that if a bunch of pastors did it together, that might create the conditions in which it's unlikely that you're going to have a member leave and go to another church, because they'd be getting the same stretch from a different pulpit, right? each of us will come up with different ways of articulating what we hope for and see on an extended horizon. But as we begin to speak about it, what we discover is that others have had that dream too. And we can elevate those others in our congregations. In my book, I suggest that congregations include a time of testimony. I suggest, I think, 1 minute, but usually it's 2 minutes, right? Give person 1 minute, they'll take 2. And share with the others in the congregation what they or their family have done recently in response to the climate crisis. And it could be that they went to a protest. It could be that they changed their gas oven to an induction one. It could be whatever. But what that will do is it will create conversations in the congregation so that what seemed unimaginable to a family might cause an elbow to be thrown and say, we could do that. You know, a moment ago I never thought we could, but she did it. We could do it, for God's sakes. So those are some partial responses. Your point is so, so important. Thank you. Thank you. Other questions? Over this a ways. How much time do we have, by the way? I have no idea. Oh, we're a little over, are we? Okay.
After Logan's question, I'm almost tempted not to say anything because that must be a good end. Mine is more prosaic, engineering point of view. Sun doesn't always shine. In fact, my solar panels are not doing much right now because of the snow. Wind doesn't always blow. What would be a good baseload power source? I'm thinking nuclear. How does that fit in with the equation? I know there's a lot of baggage with that.
So let me start with the nuclear, and then I'll sway away. Nuclear power, if you look at charts in terms of expense, nuclear power is becoming more and more expensive I'll do it your way, on a gradual basis. And there has never been a nuclear plant in America that has ever been constructed that did not exceed costs by a very significant factor. Whereas solar power, if you take the time from when Carter put it on the White House in 1979 until now, solar power is now 1/300th the cost of when Carter put it on the White House. 1/300th. So it is now the case with the cost of solar, also true of wind, that it is cheaper than fossil fuel anywhere in the world. A year ago, I couldn't say that, but the cost continues to plummet, not just go down, it is plummeting. So that's just a straightforward economic argument. Now to your first point, and in a way, your major point, well, geez, the sun doesn't always shine, and the wind doesn't always blow. What do we do on an intermittent basis? And it turns out that the amount of attention that is being given to batteries and new kinds of batteries, it's getting almost no publicity, and it's the foundation of the transition that we're going to take place. And there's all kinds of new ideas that are unfolding. Some involve, I don't know all the science behind this, but some involve iron, there's another word there, and I forget what that word is. Iron what? Pellets? Okay. And this was thought 40 years ago to be, completely undoable. But then, some scientists, they figured out some membrane in between the iron and whatever the other chemical agent is in there. And apparently these become fabulous in place, they're not portable, in place storage facilities that can replace power plants. So that the solar can produce 150% of the energy that you need during the day, and then that 50% goes into this battery that powers what is a lesser demand at night. Mark Z. Jacobson is the name of the principal scientist at Stanford who, for the past 15 years, has been doing this research first on a country-by-country basis, and he's identified 185 countries today that could just shift over. And then, about 5 years ago, he shifted and said, what about state by state by state? And in 2018, I think, is when he released his paper saying, it's now the case that every single state, autonomously, if the United States became disunited, every single state could become energy self-sufficient using only sun and wind and water. The economics are there now. It's only about who's going to control the capital. That's the only question with us anymore. Who's going to control the capital? So are we over time? Then I just want to thank you for your excellent questions, your attentiveness, your passion, and commend to you imagination as we go forward from here into our workshops. Thank you. Let's